Welcome to this session on ecotourism and wildlife tourism as part of the two-day seminar in developing heritage and nature tourism in the Humberhead Levels and the Ancone Valley. So I want to now look at aspects of ecotourism, or more correctly, I think, wildlife tourism. And I'll explain why I mean that as we go on. The headland in the view there, the Lizard Point in Cornwall, southwest England, and it's an area very extensively used for tourism visits, and where we know that in Cornwall, with its very significant tourism economy, a significant proportion of people visiting are motivated by nature, heritage, and literature associated with those. So something like 70 to 80% of people going to Cornwall go in part and heavily motivated, strongly motivated by wild nature. Now, they may not actually go out there and see it, but it's the image of that nature. So some people will walk on the cliffs and they will go and look for birds like the Cornish chough in the picture there. But many simply are motivated by Cornwall as this wild, natural and beautiful countryside. Okay, so wildlife tourism, ecotourism, the Cornish chough is a good example because it's a bird that declined dramatically, became extinct in the county, and there was a big campaign to bring it back and to manage the habitat more effectively. The bird died out largely because of the lack of grazing through cultural severance, lack of grazing on the cliff tops, so the short grass disappeared, and the short grass sward with animal dunging that the chough requires for its insect food disappeared, or was at least very significantly reduced. So a program occurred to actually restore the habitat, ultimately with the aim of reintroducing the choughs. But nature being as it is, the irony was that choughs found it themselves without any help. Birds, presumably coming over from Brittany in France, came to Cornwall and started breeding, and they became hugely iconic for the Lizard Peninsula and for Cornwall generally. You know, the Cornish chough was back. In the early days, 2004, the RSPB maintained wardens and did guided tours and events to the headland to view the nesting site. And that was worth in 2004, directly worth about £118,000 to the lizard economy, and largely through about 3.2 full-time jobs. The actual value was considerably more than that because the chough was taken as an emblem of Cornwall, as an emblem of the natural heritage of this place and a reason to go there. Now, of course, because the choughs have actually increased dramatically, you can see them all the way around the coastline. I've seen them over Marazion, where I often stay, and you get them around Land's End and those areas as well. So the chough has now increased. It's still a major draw at the Lizard and the cafes there, which boast views of the breeding choughs. So that's just one little example, but we know that leisure and tourism are widely recognised as major economic drivers. So things like kite country in mid Wales, where the kites in Britain had dwindled to a point of near extinction, certainly lost from most of the country, and down to a handful of birds in mid Wales around Rhyadr. And local farmers and the RSPB began projects to protect the kites and also to feed them with viewing stations where people could go and see them at Gigrian Farm. And it's a fantastic spectacle. This is what the public want. You can sit in a comfortable hide and you see tens and tens of these magnificent birds close to hand, along with buzzards, ravens, peregrines, sparrowhawks, and a host of other birds too. But the kite is a bird that people can see. And that launched very significant wildlife tourism to the mid Wales area. Now, how that's fared as kites are being reintroduced to the rest of the country, I'm not sure. I've been told that it's still quite an important part of that tourism economy. Once you actually tweak an economy and it starts to take off, then it will actually be easier to keep it going. Closer to home for me in the Peak District, the red deer upon the moors, a big moor in the Eastern Moors, during the September, October, November rut, then the stags are absolutely dramatic. The call carries across the moors, it's evocative, it's impressive, and the animals are big beasts. And people who didn't know they were there are absolutely blown away when they see them. But it's now become quite a major tourism draw to the eastern part of the Peak District. So again, wildlife tourism kicking in quite dramatically there. So leisure and tourism are forces for change in the environment, in society through economic impacts and various other things, and also through quality of life and health and well-being. When we look at tourism impacts, whether it's wildlife tourism, ecotourism or mass tourism, we have to look at what we call deadweight, which is what might happen if you didn't do anything. And people often forget this, that some changes, good or bad, actually happen regardless of our interventions. So deadweight is important. And displacement. If you invest in location A, what happens to the nearby location B that you don't invest in? And we saw this at the Magna Visitor Centre and Museum, just off the M1 motorway on the outskirts of Rotherham, to celebrate the steel industry. And this opened just in time for the foot and mouth lockdown of the countryside. And as a consequence of the considerable investment and from their point of view, the good fortune that other visitor centres were closed, Magna did very, very well, at least for a short time. However, one of the consequences of the improvement in visitor profile to Magna was that the nearby Elsica Heritage Centre really suffered quite badly. So you invest in one, and that might have a detrimental effect on the other. And if you're assessing economic and social impacts of these projects, then you do need to take into account both the good and the bad. So the World Tourism Organization estimated over 595 million international travellers in 1997, and they spent about 425 billion US dollars. These are big spenders, big spenders. And within that, we can look at ecotourism and we can look at wildlife tourism. Well, things like whale watching generated about $2 million revenue in 2012. It could add significantly to the global economy in terms of both money and spend. About the same time, it was worth about £20 million per year in Scotland, which surprises some people. But watching dolphins, porpoises, and various other whale species, which are becoming more common in our waters, I think we're back up to something like between 5 and 10% of the population before the catastrophic decline through hunting and exploitation. But those numbers start to actually make a resource that can guarantee people will see something interesting. And that figure of 20 million is much, much greater now. So whale watching is becoming quite a booming area. Don't worry about the detail here. This is just some data from when I first started doing work on tourism issues. And it's really to give some idea back in the 1980s, 1990s of the total international tourism scenario. So these are international tourists. So, you know, if you look at internal tourists within the regions and the countries, obviously the numbers are significant. But here we're dealing with international tourists. And the interesting point is how many of these are nature tourists or wildlife related tourists. And then the total economic impact, getting on for about $400 billion. And of that, significant amounts are nature tourists and significant amounts of wildlife-related tourism. So it's just to make the point that wildlife tourism is a big part of the potential economic benefit. And then there, 40 to 60 international tourists are nature tourists, and 20 to 40% are wildlife-related tourists. So these are big figures. Some global examples again from the 1990s, 10,000 people visiting Pembroke, Ontario to see the annual flocking swallows generated about $500,000 Canadian dollars. 17,000 birdwatchers visited Canada's Point Pelée National Park in 1987 for the spring bird migration. That generated about $6.3 million. So the figures start to be quite significant in terms of what their impact is in the economy. And then you also see lots of different organizations coming in and getting involved to offer wildlife-related holidays of various sorts and various impacts. So once the thing starts, and you get a whole set of organizations, businesses following the opportunities which are there on offer. And we see this with the Wildlife Trust and the RSPB, because they really kick-started and pioneered by Matt Raymond and Ian Dickey. Early RSPB studies looked at visitors to nature reserves, and quite clearly what the RSPB was trying to do in terms of government was to say, we're here and we're important. We're not just an add-on for wildlife, but we're actually bringing money into these rural, usually rural economies. So Bempton Cliffs RSPB Reserve, about 44,000 visitors, about £400,000. This was early days, and it has increased dramatically now. The facilities, the resources, and the visitors and the spend. Blacktop Sands RSPB Nature Reserve, just on the edge of the Humber levels, 23,000 visitors, £93,000 value to the local economy. This is 1990s figures, and they are now much, much greater. And one of the pioneering examples of this was Loch Garten, with the arrival back of the Ospreys breeding. And the great thing with Ospreys is that they are predictable as to where they're going to actually nest. So you can set up viewing platforms and cameras and facilities. Some birds like goshawk are actually quite difficult because they very unreasonably move around to different sites year to year. The Ospreys are really good. They're iconic. They are impressive to watch. They're entertaining. And we can follow that closely with things like red kites, where the introduction projects across the country, Scotland, Wales, and in England. And these have become hugely important in terms of visitors and wildlife spectacles. So what sort of impacts are we likely to have? Well, employment in the wildlife tourism industry, there are major impacts on local economies through job creation. And this may be direct or indirect. It may be that the nature reserve is employing people. It may be that people are being employed to provide guided tours or guided holidays. Or it may be indirect through other mechanisms. So you get direct employment, you get service and supplies, and through visitors drawn to an area to spend. This brings money into the local economy, and you get rounds of spending. So each £10 you put in, some of that money is recycled within the local economy, and all these contribute to generating employment opportunities. And you also have to take into account all those employed through and within the wildlife media, television, radio, magazines, books, and all the producers of equipment and bird seed and all the other things that go with wildlife and nature watching. Projects also bring down grant aid, and again, this can be very, very important to a region. So wildlife projects may draw down finance for startup or landscape recovery projects or things like that. And there's a short-term, often quite a big boost on employment through construction. So the Old Moor Nature Reserve in the RSPB Durham Valley site employed several hundred people during the construction phase, and that had an impact on the local economy through the services, through the employment, etc., and through the spend of those people being employed in the local area. That impact can actually carry on well beyond the construction phase. It may actually trigger changes in the economy, which then carry on going forwards. So there's often money for establishing infrastructure and for restoration, so landscape recovery, that sort of thing. And this can be from very modest to massive. When we look at tourism, we need to think about the different types of tourism, from green tourism to nature-based tourism to sustainable tourism. There's often weak links into mass tourism. Tourism is relevant to environmental, social, and economic sustainability, and nature is important to tourism. And amongst the definitions, there are ideas of responsible tourism. So tourism that is not necessarily ecotourism, but where it seeks to have a responsible attitude to local communities, indigenous communities, and to the economy and to the natural resources. There's some issues. Leisure and tourism, say, a major economic driver, so the major forces for change in environment, society, and the economy. They may lead or be linked to major developments, in which case they need careful planning, implementation, and monitoring. They are increasingly supported through strategic development. But it's not always what it seems or what is claimed. So we need to be careful with some of the developments which may claim to be responsible and may claim to be ecotourism or wildlife tourism, but may actually be quite damaging. Also, mass tourism can have a very major impact. It may bring economic benefits, but it may damage the core resource and impact on local people. Now, there are some problems with the idea of ecotourism, and lots and lots of things are described as, oh, it's ecotourism, but really ecotourism has the mantra of take only photographs, leave only footprints, which is great. So minimum impact. There's a problem with minimum impact in that it means you are having a limited impact, and that includes on the economy and any benefits which might accrue to local people. As soon as you actually have an impact on the economy and on local people, then strictly speaking, it isn't actually ecotourism because you're changing things. And you may change them for the better, not necessarily though, you may actually have adverse impacts. If we look at cultural tourism, we have to think about, well, what do we experience and how much do we see? How much is a Disney type show for us, a museum, a living museum? And how much is genuine insight into cultures and systems and ecologies? So here we've got indigenous peoples putting away the, in this case, an old cartoon, a videotape, cassette recorder, a television set, etc., and they're shouting, anthropologists are on the way. So we need to think about impacts of wildlife tourism, cultural tourism, and ecotourism, and exactly what do we mean? Because visitors may not always bring good tidings. They may not always lead to good effects. These are the first three galleons leaving North America, the Nina, Pinta, Santa Maria. And it says, did you detect something a little ominous in the way they said, see you later? Yes, well, I think the Native Americans probably did find something ominous in the parting gestures. So tourism and leisure are, it is claimed, the most powerful economic force on the planet. So that encourages us to try and harness their benefits and the force to improve things. Much is spoken about sustainable tourism and ecotourism, but then most research is badly informed about wildlife or conservation. And I remember having discussions with colleagues at my university who were authorities on sustainable tourism, but really didn't know much about wildlife or nature. So I said, well, what is it you're sustaining? And pure ecotourism is an insignificant niche because, again, I've talked to world experts who were verifiers for UNESCO and bodies like that, and they said they've never actually come across a long-term ecotourism project that actually worked as pure ecotourism. They morphed into something else, which isn't necessarily a problem, and it may be inevitable, but it isn't ecotourism according to the definition. There is an insidious aspect to this, however, which is that much tourism is actually parasitic. It leeches off local people, leeches off nature, leeches off the environment, and it doesn't put stuff back in. So background of all this is globalization, Disneyfication, capitalism, commoditization. And I touch on some of this in my little book, Eco-History, which I was told was far too depressing for young people to read. However, the danger is that we now know the price of everything, but the value of nothing. We've actually quantified everything. We can value ecosystem services and impacts and everything else, but we actually don't really know the value of it. And the reason that we quantify economics and nature is because for a long time, planners, politicians, and economists have said, well, how much is that wildlife worth? How much is that nature worth? And of course, we as ecologists say, oh, you can't put a price on it. And the reaction then from developers and planners is, oh, it's all right, so it has no value. We'll carry on regardless. So the idea of quantifying is to try and get over that, but it doesn't mean that the price gives you the value. The value is far greater. And it's really trying to think about the tourism, the impacts. That's a honey pot. And it isn't necessarily a problem, but if that is on a sensitive beach location, then it becomes a problem. And we're all familiar with the scenarios of the Mediterranean in the 1970s and 80s, where tourism comes in, takes over a beautiful locale, and then, of course, the tourism moves on, leaving behind a degraded, sometimes semi-derelict landscape and an economy struggling. So the tourists are fickle. They can go to new destinations, new places to discover, new beautiful places, which then will probably go through the similar sort of process if we're not careful. So some basic issues and tensions. Well, there are fundamental problems with overuse of resources, what I describe as killing the goose that lays the golden egg. So conflict between conservation and tourism and leisure. But also within conservation bodies, there can be tensions between conservation and wildlife and the business and economic development. And this is more and more obvious the larger the conservation bodies become, because they have to become big corporate organizations. They have to start to have their visions, their messages, their controls, and their business managers. And as long as that is all focused on the priority, which is conservation, wildlife, and maybe heritage, then we're okay. But if things start to move away, which does sometimes happen, then there may be a problem. And that problem can run quite deep. And quite often people interested in conservation and heritage and wildlife are not that interested in business, economy and development, and sometimes vice versa. So there are also issues between conservation organisations, particularly when it comes to tourism. Now, generally conservation NGOs and agencies collaborate over nature conservation issues and targets and visions. However, and often unspoken, when it comes to visitors and members and drawing down grants, then they behave as typical tourism attractions and tourism attraction organisations, in that they are competing for those members, visitors, and that spend. So very often if you go to one organisation, you won't find information on nearby destinations owned and managed by other organisations, their competitors. As a visitor, what you want is all the information you can get. You want to go to, say, Wildflower Wetlands Trust site one weekend and maybe come back and go to the nearby RSPB site for a change the next weekend. Or you might think, well, there's an RSPB site and a Wildlife Trust site. I might come back and spend a few days. That's the idea. That's what we're aiming for. But for the organisations, they get a little bit concerned about visitors going to their competitors rather than to them. So a nice example of a wildlife tourism destination, RSPB Old Moor and Gannett's Cafe. So there was great potential for tourism to support and trigger local economic recovery, and particularly in rural areas or sometimes in urban fringe, semi-rural, derelict, semi-derelict post-industrial landscapes, like the Dearne Valley with the Old Moor site. And that's been a dramatic recovery. It's turned one of the poorest, one of the most degraded landscapes in Western Europe into a tourism visitor economy with huge biodiversity potential, and also 100,000 visitors a year, boosting that local economy, paying for the nature reserve. So that's great. So wildlife and heritage tourism and leisure, enhancing and supporting an emerging tourism industry and thus the local economy. And this can be very important. Late 1990s, when we were doing some of the work on this, Yorkshire had 13 million trips, 42 million nights, and 1,691 million pounds spent from tourism. South Yorkshire, on the other hand, only had 2 million trips, about 6 million nights, and 194 million pounds spent. So really quite poor. So things like the Old Moor project were designed in part to try and boost that set of figures to grow the tourism industry and the associated spend. Some key issues to think about. One, don't assume that things are integrated and joined up in terms of approaches. They're often not. Many strategies for tourism, leisure and countryside recreation, regional development and nature or heritage conservation are actually very fragmented and uncoordinated. And this has been compounded dramatically by cuts in local authorities and agencies over the last 20 years, leading very often to a lack of vision, a lack of strategy, and a lack of cohesiveness. There's also an absence of a vibrant farming community in many rural areas, and this can be a big problem. So residential populations often drifted away. The ones that remain age. They're reduced to fringing commuter dormitories for adjacent cities and towns. You only have to look at somewhere like the Peak District on the edge of Sheffield and between Sheffield and Manchester. And there's not that many people who live there who are actually employed in the rural landscape. And most people who are in the rural landscape actually working can't afford to live there. Things are compounded by changes in the landscape and in the relationship between people and landscapes, what we call cultural severance, the ending of subsistence use of landscapes and ecology. And also, if you're going to transform these economies which have suffered, then you need to create opportunities to spend, because visitors have to actually spend money in that local economy, in that locale. And if you don't have the opportunities there, then you may have visitors, but you won't get any economic benefit. There's some big problems. This is a North American national park back in the 50s, huge numbers of visitors going. But one of the issues is that tourism is fickle, it's often unreliable, it's often highly seasonal. And these can all be problems for rural economies, which actually need stability, reliability, and predictability. You've only got to go to a seaside resort on the English coastline and go in winter and see a whole settlement with hardly any lights on, because nobody lives there. But tourism and leisure can support rural regeneration. So food from the forest, for example, the national forest, you can actually grow the distinctiveness of the local experience, and you can populate that with food and drink, cuisine, which is locally distinctive and links into the local farming economy. So that can be very, very useful. I stuck the wheat here in there just as a reminder of some of the peculiarities of cuisine and local rural economies and employment. These birds used to be called snorters. They migrate through the South Downs in England from the European continent, and they used to be tracked by shepherds in the 1800s. And about 2 or 3 weeks of trapping wheat ears, which are then dispatched and sent to upmarket restaurants and hotels in Eastbourne, Brighton, and in London, the shepherds made more money in those 2 or 3 weeks than the entire rest of the year. So those were snorters, deep fried, I believe. Projects like RSPB Down Valley drive regional economic, environmental and social recovery. But we have to be careful with many developments because we're often dealing with short-term planning and economic development. And lots of developments are given a gloss, a claim, if you like, for being eco-friendly. They're being green. So we have to be careful of what I call the gloss of eco-greenwash, because lots of developments, lots of projects which are described as ecologically friendly are nothing of the sort. So we need to be very careful about that. Old Moor is a remarkable example of the transformation from dereliction to a thriving biodiverse rich and resource rich in terms of facilities, etc., situation from a derelict site to a really thriving economic hub. Opportunities to spend. The Heritage Lottery put money into the car park, the offices, the shop, the garden centre, the car parking, the toilets, basic facilities to bring in the customers and allow people to spend money and visit the site. People now go there simply for the Sunday lunch and they sit there and they look at the nature reserve from outside, but don't go in. That doesn't matter. They're putting money into the economy. They're putting money into the pockets of the RSPB and the employees. So this is all a good thing. So some tourism basics. We need to think about welcoming the visitor to our location, be it the region or the actual attraction. What sort of attractions bring people in? Well, you need to think about your market and your distinctive, your unique selling points. And if you've got something like the Major Oak, you don't need to do much else. You just need to make sure that it's managed sustainably, which of course in that case it wasn't, because people's footfall damaged the roots. So it's now managed much more carefully. But basically, if you've got a stunning, spectacular experience, then you use that as the hub of your tourism attraction. You can also create things, spectacles and spectaculars, events and activities. Think about the messages you're putting out and the promotion that you give them. We have the Haxie Hud game in the Humberhead levels, which came about centuries ago when the lady of the manor's hat blew off and was rescued by the local youths, and they gave the hat back and she presented them with a sort of leather football type thing, and each year they now compete for this ball between the two pubs in the village, and they either go up or they go down, and they spend about a day with a huge scrimmage trying to get to one pub or the other. So some of these things can be spectacularly successful in terms of impact through an event linked to your location, linked to your history, your heritage. You can also invent them. The Malden Mud Race in Essex was created by some people sat in a pub one New Year, and they decided to run across the steep sloping gullies of the salt marsh and mudflats, which is a pretty grim experience, particularly when it's cold. Next year, the local rugby club did it as a sponsored event, and then it's grown to something like a massive event with 10,000 or more spectators and hundreds of participants raising thousands of pounds for good causes, charities and the like. Totally a created experience, but it has a feeling of something that is traditional. Some basic economics. The impacts that you may have from recreational activities, i.e. leisure and tourism, vary. So tourism to recreational day visits to local visitor impacts. these get easier from the local to the recreational day visit. So that's the easy pickings, the low-hanging fruit, but you get less bang for your buck. So local visitors are easier, they're more reliable, they're less demanding, they spend less money. A weak tourism base can be grown over time from a strong day visitor profile. And then, so if you've got, if you're already in a situation where you've got weak tourism, so not a strong base, you can grow it. But it's easiest to grow it from your day visitor profile. And therefore you need to think about demographics, transport, access, etc. And that might then form a basis to enhance the actual tourism visitor base. You need to think about facilities, resources and infrastructure, what you might need in terms of gearing up across the region. Because if you're going to get visitors, you need to have the facilities, the infrastructure. So this is where the day visitor base can actually help to grow those key resources and the infrastructure and make them sustainable. And from that, you can grow your weak tourism base into a stronger tourism economy. And in all this, nature-based attractions and attractants are especially helpful. There are some problems with nature-based attractions in that they are landscape scale, they're not countable, so we often take them for granted, and they often don't directly bring in the money or receive the income. But they might be the backdrop that attracts people to come to the shops, the cafes, the restaurants, the visitor centres. So we need to think about that. There are links between natural resources and tourism economic activity. So again, you need to think about, well, what's the backdrop, what's the heritage, what's the nature, and how are you going to grow the tourism economic activity, which keeps people employed, able to live in an area, etc., etc. So money is very important, although quite often when we're dealing with conservation organisations and conservation activists, if you like, they may not be so interested in that, but at the end of the day, you have to be able to pay for all the things that you want to do. It's very important as well, I think, to consider synergies and connections, which may be between different aspects of the landscape, different aspects of the tourism experience, different organisations, different stakeholders. You need to think about converting visitors to local spend. That requires infrastructure. That means you may need to invest, and in some cases you may need to invest in quite a major way. And there are risks and issues of economics which go with that spending. However, there's a complication. It's actually relatively easy to draw down significant grant aid for capital investment. So if you want to purchase land or develop a nature reserve visitor facility or something like that, it may be quite straightforward to get significant sums of money. And you think, oh, that's great, that reduces the risk. However, the real risk when you're spending this money, when you're investing, when you're developing your infrastructure, the real risk is actually covering your revenue costs. So you can build a structure, you can build a visitor centre, doesn't mean people will come and doesn't mean people will spend money. So this affects project viability, be it private sector through to conservation charities or government agencies. And this can be make or break for your tourism initiative. And some of you will remember the ill-fated Earth Centre at Doncaster, Conisbrough. So that opened up, it spent something like £75 million of public money, and it was an unmitigated disaster. The idea was very good, but they discriminated against car visitors from the outset, even though there wasn't really good public transport to the site. There was also nowhere that you could stay locally and nowhere that you could, say, host a conference locally. So that has a big impact on financial viability. And discriminating against car drivers simply meant people didn't go. The place wasn't built when it was open. It was, you got it part way through happening, and that didn't really work. And I was somewhat galled when the really nice wildflower meadows that I'd identified for them on the hillside beyond all got bulldozed as part of the development, even though we pointed out where they were. So that was a bit unforgivable. And it was a disaster for the region in terms of future investment. It was really sent out a bad message, whereas the Eden project is different. Exciting the visitor, get their interest. You want to get them excited. You want to keep the interest, give them some tasty tidbits. And it doesn't have to be too sophisticated. This is the amazing badger set, a giant sort of papier-mâché type badger set. And it is wonderful, 10 times the real size. Kids love it. They go through and then they find huge, giant papier-mâché badgers, and a light comes on and you've got this big badger. I'm sure it's the sort of thing that gives some kids nightmares, but they seem to really enjoy it. That was great. And there we are, the giant badger. And you have to keep people's excitement and interest. These are my visitors from Ukraine and Poland a few years back when we took them around the great badger set at Wenlata, all part of the visitor centre. Fantastic visitor centre. It wasn't just the slightly enough badger set, but they love the badger set. Not only do kids like to go through it time and time again, but my adults wanted to go through several times. They thought it was wonderful. So it doesn't have to be sophisticated, doesn't have to be expensive. It can sometimes just be quite imaginative. So keep them excited, keep them on the toes, keep them motivated. Contact with heritage and nature can be free. It can be very low cost in terms of facilities. It's often open access. It's often uncounted. It's often taken for granted. And yet these networks of open countryside, forest parks, woodlands, greenways, cycleways, etc., are often the backdrop for the tourism industry. The actual facilities and the support is low cost, it's low risk, and to some extent, I say, has limited social and economic benefits directly. Quite clearly, this landscape has a fantastic, huge impact on health and well-being, which is now being more widely recognised. But in terms of actual visitor spend, this is a backdrop that brings the money in elsewhere. And that does give us issues in terms of actually recognising the value of these and also in terms of maintaining them. So if we're developing a tourism economy, what's the hook? What's the visitor centre? What's the unique selling point? Scale. Well, for a visitor centre, it can be very modest and simple to very, very sophisticated. Who owns it? Who establishes it? Well, it might be NGOs, might be public sector, might be private sector, it might be partnerships. Partnerships often provide very, very good mechanisms for tapping into the strengths of each of the key stakeholders. What about the issues of investment and risk, as I've said earlier? They need to be considered very, very carefully. And in the cold light of day, it's no good having ambitious, inflated targets, which are just not going to happen. What's the function of a visitor centre? We need to think about why are we doing it? What's its role in the wider scenario? What are the economic impacts likely to be? And increasingly, if you're bringing down grant aid, you will have to explain what the economic impacts are going to be and how this is going to be sustained and how you're going to maximise and grow those benefits. At the end of it, though, for a visitor centre, what the public want are spectacles and spectaculars. They want something that gives them the wow factor. And nature is really good for that. So we need to think about the visitors. We need to think about what motivates them. Why are they going to come somewhere? And it might be something dramatic like Kew Gardens with history and beautiful landscapes and rare plants and culture and ecology, etc. Or somewhere like Slimbridge Wildflower Centre, dramatic sunset there, absolutely gorgeous and teeming with birds and really good access so people get close to. Lots of information and of course the basics, car park, loose top, cafe, bookshop, general shop, etc., etc. So you've got all the facilities that you need. It can be quite modest. This is Low Sizer Barn, south of Cumbria. just south of the Lake District. And it started off as pick your own strawberries about 20 years previously. And by this time in the early 90s, it had grown into a full-fledged visitor centre, a nice cafe restaurant where you can watch the cows being milked, shops selling high-quality cuisine, local cuisine from all over the world. Get your mind around that. And all sorts of other stuff. There's a nature trail, visitor experiences, crafts and other activities, all private sector. And it's on an arterial route from the motorway to the Lake District. So it's a win-win.